Everyone thought the billionaire's father had only 3 months left to live. The doctors had tried everything, the treatments had failed, and his condition was getting worse every day. His family began to accept the painful reality. But just when all hope seemed lost, a woman who had recently started working in the house, a quiet, humble maid, noticed something others didn't. She took a risk, started digging deeper, and uncovered a possibility no one else had considered. What she found would change everything. This wasn't just a story about illness and medicine. It became a story about sacrifice, love, and a decision that would shake an entire family to its core. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard had always felt invincible. He was a billionaire who controlled powerful companies, managed hundreds of employees, and had built an empire with his own hands. But everything changed on a cold Tuesday morning. He received a call from the hospital where his elderly father had been undergoing tests. The doctor's voice was calm but direct. Richard's father had been diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer. Richard stood frozen in his office, unable to speak. His father was 78 years old, and the doctors estimated he had only a few months left. That man had been his support throughout life, offering advice, love, and strength. The news hit Richard like a wall. It didn't matter how much money he had or how many businesses he ran. In that moment, he was just a son facing the loss of someone he couldn't imagine life without. His heart sank as the reality of the diagnosis started to take shape in his mind. As soon as Richard gathered himself, he rushed to the hospital to be with his father. He remembered all the times they had spent together, fishing on weekends, celebrating birthdays, and talking late at night about life and work. Now, everything felt like it was slipping away. The doctors explained that the cancer was already advanced and spreading quickly. Still, the family chose to fight back with every resource available. They started with aggressive chemotherapy sessions, hoping to reduce the tumor's growth. When that didn't work, they tried immunotherapy. After that, they enrolled his father in international clinical trials. Each treatment brought a spark of hope, but every time, that hope faded when tests showed no progress. Richard poured millions into medical research, hired specialists from different countries, and even explored experimental options. He wasn't ready to lose his father. He needed more time, more chances, anything that could delay the inevitable. But deep inside, he feared they were only delaying the pain, not the outcome. Richard, already deeply affected by the death of his wife years earlier, felt that old wound reopen. His wife's passing had left him emotionally drained, and it had taken years to build a life again. Now, that pain returned even stronger. Losing a parent was different. His father had been there from the beginning, someone who always listened, guided, and never judged. He found himself sleeping in the hospital chair, holding his father's hand during the night. During the day, he rarely left the room, only stepping out for short meetings or to take important calls. But even then, his mind remained in that hospital room. He shared old stories with his father, trying to bring some joy into those difficult days. He brought photo albums, played their favorite music, and even laughed with him when they recalled funny memories. But behind every smile, Richard hid the fear that any moment could be their last. He couldn't stop thinking about how little time they had left. As the weeks passed, the signs of decline became more obvious. His father started having trouble eating, moving, and staying awake. He would sleep for long hours, waking only for a few minutes at a time. The doctors did their best to manage the pain, but there was nothing more they could do to stop the disease. Richard watched helplessly as the man who once stood so strong became weaker each day. He tried to stay positive around his father, acting as if things could still improve. But as soon as he stepped out of the room, the truth hit him hard. He would cry in empty hospital corridors, hiding from the nurses and other patients. He hated feeling powerless. For someone used to solving problems and fixing situations with money and influence, this was torture. There was nothing he could buy, no favor he could call in, and no decision he could make to save his father. He had never felt so small. Richard's relationship with his father had always been strong. They didn't always agree on business or politics, but there was always respect and love between them. In those final weeks, they talked about everything: life, regrets, dreams, and even death. His father was calm about his condition. He said he had lived a good life and that he was proud of Richard. Those words broke Richard even more. He didn't want pride. He wanted more time. He wanted one more year, one more holiday together, even one more walk in the park. Every conversation they had felt like it might be the last. Richard began recording some of their talks, hoping to keep his father's voice alive forever. He wrote down everything they discussed, every joke, every lesson. He knew he couldn't stop time, but he tried to hold on to every second. Being there, listening and loving was all he could do now, even as his father's body continued to weaken. The days turned into a quiet routine. Mornings began with nurses checking vitals and Richard arriving with fresh coffee and a forced smile. Afternoons were filled with silence, stories and occasional visits from close friends and family. Nights were harder, long, emotional and quiet, except for the sound of the machines. Richard rarely slept at home. The hospital room had become his new reality. Each passing day brought more signs that the end was near. His father's voice had grown softer, and sometimes he couldn't speak at all. But Richard stayed there, never leaving his side. He held his father's hand, even when he was too weak to hold back. They no longer talked much, but being together was enough. Richard tried not to think about what came next. All he could do was stay present, face the reality, and give his father as much peace as possible. The disease was winning, and Richard knew time was running out. When the doctors finally sat down with Richard and told him the truth, it felt like everything stopped. There was no more treatment, no more tests, no more medical plans. His father had only 3 months left, maybe less. The cancer was too advanced, and it was spreading faster than they had expected. Richard was crushed. He had spent weeks fighting, spending millions, calling experts and chasing hope. Now, all he could do was wait and watch. He sat quietly in the hospital room, staring at his father, who was sleeping. The silence was heavy. Richard didn't know how to tell his father the news, but when he finally did, the reaction surprised everyone. His father took a deep breath, looked at him, and simply said he wanted a birthday party. No drama, no tears, just a quiet, honest request. It had been decades since he last celebrated. He wanted music, cake, old friends, and laughter. He wanted one last day of joy, not as a patient, but as a man. Richard didn't know how to react at first. He'd expected his father to be sad or angry, but instead the old man smiled. It wasn't a big request, but it meant everything. Richard nodded and promised to make it happen. That same night, he started calling people. He contacted the hospital staff to ask what could be done. He spoke with his father's oldest friends, some of whom he hadn't seen in years. Everyone was shocked, but most agreed to come. Richard hired a small event team to help organize everything within the hospital limits. The plan was to transform the common room into a party space. They would bring in a cake, some simple decorations, and a playlist of his father's favorite songs. It wouldn't be a huge party, but it would be meaningful. For the first time in weeks, Richard saw a change in his father's face. He looked more alive, more excited. The thought of the party gave him something to look forward to. As preparations began, the entire hospital got involved. Nurses who had spent weeks caring for Richard's father offered to help decorate. A doctor who played the guitar volunteered to perform some music. One of the cooks said she could bake a special cake based on an old recipe. Richard made sure every detail was handled with care. He ordered comfortable chairs, made sure there was a wheelchair available, and checked the medical equipment so his father could attend safely. More calls were made. Family members, cousins, and a few distant relatives were invited. Some couldn't come, but many said yes. Each new confirmation brought a spark to the old man's eyes. Every day he asked about the progress, what music would play, who said they were coming, would there be balloons? These questions became part of their daily talks. For a man so close to the end, the party wasn't just an event. It was a reason to wake up, to eat better, and to smile again. Richard watched the transformation closely. His father, who had been weak and quiet for days, started sitting up more often. He asked to shave and even requested a haircut. The nurses noticed it too. He was more alert, more active. Though still fragile, he seemed to regain a little strength. Richard couldn't believe how a simple idea had changed everything. The party was now scheduled for the following weekend, and everyone was working hard to make it special. Richard asked his assistant to find photos from his father's youth, including old group photos from college, work, and vacations. He had them printed and framed to display at the party. A playlist was made, full of old hits and personal favorites. Even his father's childhood friend, who now lived in another city, confirmed he would come. For Richard, all of this brought a strange mix of feelings, sadness, pride, and even happiness. He was losing his father, but he was also giving him one last moment to feel like himself. As the party day approached, Richard felt more nervous than he had in any business deal. Everything had to go right. The hospital had set aside a few hours where they would allow more guests and slightly relax the visiting rules. The medical team remained close, just in case anything went wrong. When the day finally arrived, the room was decorated with colorful banners, photos, and flowers. The guests began arriving slowly. Some were older and needed help walking, while others brought gifts or old letters. When Richard's father entered the room in his wheelchair, everyone stood and clapped. He looked around, smiled wide, and even let out a laugh. People hugged him, shared memories, and took pictures. The music played softly in the background. There was laughter, there were a few tears, but most of all, there was warmth. For a few hours, it didn't feel like a hospital. It felt like a family celebration. And in the center of it all was the man who wanted nothing more than to feel alive again. For Richard, watching his father that day meant everything. All the pain, the sadness, and the fear were still there, but they didn't take over. Instead, he focused on his father's smile, the way he held hands with old friends, the way he closed his eyes while listening to his favorite song. At one point, Richard brought out the cake. Everyone sang. His father didn't make a wish. He just looked at Richard and said, "Thank you." That moment stayed in Richard's heart. It was more than a party. It was proof that even in the middle of death, life still had something to offer. That simple request, a birthday celebration, became a symbol of strength, not weakness. It reminded everyone that joy is still possible, even in the hardest moments. And for Richard, it was a chance to honor his father, not just with words or care, but with something real. A memory, a moment of happiness before the end. Something he would carry with him forever. In the middle of all the sadness and stress surrounding Richard and his father, there was one person who never left their side, Amara. She had worked in the mansion for decades. At first, she was just hired to clean the house, take care of the laundry, and help with meals. Over the years, however, she became much more than a regular employee. She was always around, always reliable. After Richard's wife died, it was Amara who stepped up. She cooked for him when he couldn't eat, reminded him to sleep, and just sat with him in silence when he didn't want to talk. Now, with his father so sick, her attention shifted naturally. She started helping the old man every day. She helped him get out of bed in the morning, made sure he took his pills, and kept him company during the long hospital visits. She didn't wait to be asked. She just did what needed to be done, always with calm, care, and respect. Richard began to notice that Amara was doing more than anyone else. It wasn't just about doing chores or helping out. She was deeply involved. Whenever the nurses left, Amara was still there. She knew how to calm his father when he got agitated. She prepared his favorite soups without asking. Sometimes she would read to him when he was too tired to hold a book. Other times she would just sit quietly and hold his hand. At night, when everyone else went home, she stayed in the hospital room, sleeping in a chair just to be close. Richard never told her to do any of this. It came from her own heart. One night he thanked her and she just smiled and said, "He needs me." It became clear to Richard that her connection to his father went far beyond duty. She cared deeply, not because it was her job, but because she truly wanted to be there for him. Amara's story was not something many people knew. She didn't talk much about her past, but one evening, while sitting beside Richard during a quiet moment, she finally shared it. When she was young, she had a sister who was very sick. They didn't have enough money to pay for good medical care. Her sister's condition got worse over time, and eventually she passed away. Amara had always blamed herself, even though there was nothing she could have done. That loss stayed with her for years. It changed how she saw the world. She made a silent promise back then. If she ever had the chance to help someone again, she would never walk away. That's why she was the way she was now. Richard listened carefully. Suddenly, everything made sense. The way Amara took care of his father, the way she never complained, the way she gave everything she had to help. This wasn't just kindness. It was something deeply personal to her. Richard started seeing Amara as part of the family, not just a staff member. He realized how much she had done not just now, but for many years. She had held the family together in moments when everything was falling apart. He remembered how she stayed after his wife's funeral, organizing meals, comforting the guests, and quietly keeping things running in the background. Now she was doing the same for his father. Every day, she showed up early, stayed late, and made sure no detail was forgotten. The doctors and nurses began to rely on her too. They often asked her about small things they had missed, what his father had eaten, whether he had any pain, how his mood was. Amara always knew the answer. She was more than a caregiver. She was a bridge between the family and the hospital. She made sure the emotional side of care wasn't ignored. Richard trusted her completely and felt less alone knowing she was there. For Richard's father, Amara became a lifeline. He didn't need to explain anything to her. She already knew what he wanted even before he said it. When he was too tired to speak, she would bring a warm towel or adjust his pillow. When he was in pain, she would gently touch his shoulder and reassure him. Sometimes she would joke with him, and he would smile a little. That small smile meant the world to everyone. One afternoon, Richard found the two of them watching an old TV show together. His father looked more relaxed than he had in days. It was a moment that didn't need words. Amara brought comfort in a way no one else could. It wasn't about medical training or formal support. It was about presence, about knowing someone was truly there for you. She didn't ask for thanks. She didn't expect praise. For her, this was something she had to do. It was part of who she had become. As time went on, Richard realized something important. His father's final days were made better because of Amara. Without her, things would have been much harder, emotionally, physically, and even logistically. She had taken her pain from the past and turned it into care for someone else. Her promise to never abandon someone again had become her mission in life. She was not just a helper or an employee. She was a protector, a steady presence when everything else felt like it was falling apart. Richard felt deeply grateful. He didn't always know how to say it. but he tried to show it in small ways. He made sure Amara had everything she needed and told her often that he appreciated her. And even though she never asked for anything in return, he knew that what she gave to the family was priceless. In the middle of all the suffering, Amara stood out. Her care, born from her own loss, had become a life-saving light for Richard's father. The day of the party finally arrived. Richard had spent days making sure everything was prepared, and now the mansion looked completely different. It was not a grand, luxurious event, but a simple and warm one, exactly as his father had wished. There were a few colorful balloons tied near the entrance, a large table with a cake in the middle, and small candles waiting to be lit. The furniture had been rearranged to make space for guests, many of whom had known his father for decades. The old man was dressed neatly and sat in a comfortable chair, looking fragile but smiling with a kind of quiet happiness. One by one, old friends arrived, greeting him with hugs and small gifts. Some brought flowers, others brought cards, and everyone had a story to share. The room filled with laughter, soft music, and the sound of familiar voices. For a moment, the mansion no longer felt like a place of worry, but of celebration. Amara had been there since early morning, helping with every detail. She made sure the cake was set up, the drinks were ready, and the guests were welcomed. She moved quietly through the room, checking on Richard's father every few minutes, adjusting his blanket, offering him small bites of food, and making sure he stayed comfortable. Even though she was working, she smiled each time he looked at her. It was clear to everyone that she wasn't just a helper. She cared deeply. When the guests saw her guiding him gently or helping him stand for a photo, they whispered about how devoted she was. Richard noticed it too. He had always known Amara was important to their family, but at this moment he understood even more. She wasn't just part of the staff, she was part of their lives. His father, who had been tired and weak in recent weeks, seemed more alive now than he had in months, thanks in part to her steady presence. The party went on with small, heartfelt moments. Old friends told stories about the past, some of them funny, some of them moving. Laughter mixed with a few tears as memories were shared. Richard's father listened, sometimes speaking softly, sometimes just smiling while holding someone's hand. The cake was finally brought out, and everyone sang. He closed his eyes for a second, but didn't make a wish. Instead, he looked around at all the faces. Amara stood close by, holding a plate and ready to serve slices to the guests. She made sure he had the first piece. The music played gently in the background, old songs he loved from his youth. For a while, the illness didn't seem to exist. The room felt full of life, not death. Richard stood back for a moment, taking in the scene. This was exactly what his father had asked for, and seeing him so content gave Richard a small sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. But then, in the middle of all the joy, something unexpected happened. His father reached out and took Amara's hand. He held it tightly, as if drawing strength from her. The room became quieter as people noticed the gesture. Amara looked at him, unsure what he wanted to say. He leaned a little closer and, with a weak but clear voice, asked, "Will I still live, my daughter?" He didn't call her Amara or my helper, but my daughter, as if in that moment she was the only person who could tell him the truth. The question froze everything. Conversations stopped. The music no longer seemed to matter. It wasn't just a question about time. It was a plea for reassurance, for hope. Amara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She squeezed his hand back, knowing everyone was watching. It was a moment that hung heavy in the air, more powerful than any words spoken during the party so far. Amara took a deep breath before answering. She didn't lie, but she didn't give him the answer he feared either. She simply said, softly, "I will always be here with you." It was not a promise of life, but a promise of presence. Her voice trembled slightly, but she stayed strong, keeping her composure for his sake. His father blinked slowly and gave a faint smile, as if the answer was enough. Around them, people began to shift awkwardly, some looking down, some wiping their eyes. Richard stood only a few steps away, his chest tightening. He had never heard his father speak like that, and he had never seen Amara respond with such quiet strength. In that small exchange, something larger became clear. His father saw Amara as more than an employee. She had become family. The simplicity of her reply filled the room with an unspoken truth. No one could stop what was coming, but no one had to face it alone. Richard couldn't hold back his emotions. Hearing his father's question and Amara's answer broke something inside him. He stepped away from the crowd, leaning against the wall as tears filled his eyes. All the weeks of holding himself together, making plans, and trying to stay strong came crashing down. He had planned this party to give his father a final happy moment, but he hadn't expected it to be this raw, this real. Watching his father call Amara "my daughter" showed him how deep their bond had grown. It also reminded him of the inevitability of what lay ahead. He wiped his face quickly, not wanting his father to see him cry, but it was too late. The moment had already passed through everyone in the room. The music resumed softly. People began to talk again, but Richard stayed still, feeling both proud and heartbroken. In the middle of the party's warmth, his father's quiet question and Amara's promise had changed everything for him. That night, after the party, Amara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the words Richard's father had said. "Will I still live, my daughter?" His voice kept repeating in her head like an alarm. No matter how much she tried to calm herself down, the question wouldn't go away. It felt like a blade cutting deep into her thoughts. She had seen many people pass through pain in her life, but this one was different. This time, it felt personal. She didn't want to just wait for the end. She wanted to fight, even if no one else believed there was a way. She turned on her old laptop, which took several minutes to load. She sat at the kitchen table and started searching for possible treatments. Most of the options were ones Richard had already tried. But then something new appeared, a living donor liver transplant. It was rare and risky, especially for someone his age. Still, it gave her hope. Amara read everything she could find. The articles talked about the risks of operating on elderly patients, the strict conditions required, and the limited cases of success. Still, a few stories stood out. Older patients who had survived the surgery thanks to living donors. The donor had to be a match in blood type and liver size. It wasn't common, but it wasn't impossible either. As she scrolled through the screen, she asked herself if this was something she could do. She wasn't young, but she was healthy, and more importantly, she was willing. She didn't want to watch Richard's father fade away, knowing she might have had the chance to stop it. The next morning, without telling anyone, she made a phone call to a private clinic in the city. She told them she wanted to test her compatibility for a liver donation. They gave her an appointment for the following day. She took the bus early in the morning and walked into the clinic alone. The doctors at the clinic were surprised by her request. They asked a lot of questions. Who was the patient? Why wasn't the family involved? Did she understand the risks? Amara answered everything clearly. She said she wanted to do this on her own, without telling the family, at least for now. She didn't want to raise hope or cause conflict until she had a real answer. The doctors agreed, but made her sign forms confirming she understood the danger to her own health. She wasn't scared. She'd already made her choice. Over the next few days, she went through a full set of medical tests, blood samples, imaging, physical evaluations, and psychological interviews. It was exhausting. She still had to work at the mansion, take care of Richard's father, and pretend like everything was normal. No one noticed her trips to the clinic. No one saw the worry behind her quiet face. She kept the secret to herself, focused only on the goal, helping him live. 1 week later, she received a call from the clinic. Her heart beat fast as she answered. The doctor's voice was calm, almost too calm, as he explained the results. She sat down at the edge of her bed, holding the phone tightly. She was a perfect match. Blood type, liver function, size, everything lined up. It was rare, but it was real. For a few seconds, Amara couldn't speak. Then tears came. She cried softly, alone in her room, not from fear, but from the weight of what she had just learned. She now held the possibility of saving his life. It wasn't a guarantee, there were still many risks, but this was something solid, something no one else had been able to offer. When the envelope with the results arrived by mail the next day, she stared at it for a long time before opening it. She read every word carefully, then folded the paper and placed it in a drawer away from sight, but not from mind. Amara didn't know how to tell Richard. She feared he would say no, especially if he thought it would endanger her health. But to her, it wasn't about danger. It was about love and gratitude. Richard's father had been like family to her for years. He had shown her respect, kindness, and trust, even when others saw her only as a worker. Over time, he became a father figure, and when he called her daughter at the party, she felt something deep shift inside her. That word meant everything. She remembered her own sister, the one she lost young, and the helplessness of not being able to save her. She had promised herself never to feel that way again. This time, she could act. This time, she could be the difference. She carried that thought with her every day as she cared for him, hiding the truth in her heart while waiting for the right time to speak. She wasn't afraid of giving a part of herself. The envelope with the test results stayed hidden in her drawer, but Amara checked on it every night. She would open it, read the name compatible donor, and close it again. She thought of telling Richard many times, but always stopped. The moment never felt right. Sometimes he was too stressed, sometimes too tired, and other times she doubted herself. What if the surgery failed? What if they blamed her if something went wrong? Still, the decision stayed clear in her mind. She wasn't just doing this because of guilt or duty. She was doing it because she loved that man like family. He had given her a place in his home, and more importantly, in his heart. Now she was ready to give something back. That night, after checking the envelope one more time, she closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "I'm ready." She didn't know what Richard would say, but she knew what she had to do. She was no longer just an employee. She was someone willing to give life. Amara walked into the hospital with the test results in her bag and a serious look on her face. She had spent days preparing for this moment. After all the sleepless nights, the quiet planning, and the private exams, she was finally ready to speak up. She asked to speak with the transplant team. Sitting across from a doctor, she opened the envelope and calmly explained that she was a perfect match to donate part of her liver. She said she understood the risks and was completely willing to go ahead with the surgery. The room went silent. The doctor read the results, then looked at her with sympathy but firmness. "I'm sorry," he said. "The law does not allow living donations unless the donor is a close blood relative or legal family." Amara sat there, stunned. She explained how much Richard's father meant to her. It didn't matter. Rules were rules. The hospital would not move forward. Her hope crashed instantly, replaced by frustration and sadness. She left the hospital in silence. The folder with the test results felt heavier in her hands now. When she returned to the mansion, she walked straight to her room, sat on the bed, and cried quietly. Later that night, she couldn't hold it in anymore and told Richard everything. She explained that she had gone behind his back to see if she could donate her liver. She described how she had matched perfectly, how she believed it could work, and how the hospital had refused to proceed because she wasn't legally part of the family. Richard stared at her, completely speechless. At first, he didn't know how to react. Then his face turned pale, and panic took over. "Amara, no!" he said firmly. "You can't even think about this." He reminded her that he had already lost his wife, and his father was already dying. If anything happened to her, he couldn't bear it. He begged her to stop before it went too far, but Amara was not moved by his plea. She listened carefully, took a deep breath, and explained that she had already made her choice. Richard shook his head, trying to reason with her. "You're not responsible for saving everyone," he told her. "You've already done more than enough." But Amara stood by what she believed. "He's my family," she said quietly. "Maybe not by law, maybe not by blood, but he's family in my heart." Richard looked at her, stunned by her words. He had never seen her like this, so strong, so firm. He realized this wasn't just about a medical decision. It was about who Amara had become to them over the years. Still, he couldn't accept it. He paced the room, desperate to change her mind. "Please don't do this. I couldn't stand losing you too." But Amara didn't budge. She had come too far to walk away now. In her heart, there was no turning back. She started searching online again, this time focusing on hospitals outside the country. She knew it was risky, expensive, and complicated, but she couldn't give up. Her nights were filled with calls, emails, and research. She reached out to clinics and transplant centers across Europe and Asia. Most gave the same answer. They followed the same rules as her home country. A few didn't even respond. But then, one day, she got a reply from a doctor in a small clinic abroad. The message was short, but promising. The doctor asked for a phone call. When they spoke, Amara explained everything: her connection to the patient, her test results, and her frustration with the system. The doctor listened carefully, then paused. He told her he had once lost his own daughter to a liver condition. That loss had changed his view on many things. He said he would review her case. For the first time in days, Amara felt a tiny flicker of hope again. A few days later, the foreign doctor confirmed he would take the case. He explained that his clinic had different rules and more flexibility. As long as she passed a few extra health checks and signed a full risk agreement, they could schedule the transplant. Amara sat in shock for a moment, then began crying, this time from relief. She knew this was far from over. The road ahead was still full of risk. Traveling, surgery, post-op recovery. It would all be difficult, but now she had something she hadn't had before. A real chance. She kept the news to herself for a few more days, unsure how Richard would react. When she finally told him, he was furious at first. "You're going to leave the country for this?" he asked. But after a long talk, filled with tears and silence, he realized she wasn't going to change her mind. It wasn't just about saving a life. It was about love, duty, and a promise she had made to herself long ago. And so, the plan began to form. A quiet, risky, and emotional mission that could change everything. Amara worked silently in the background, arranging travel documents, preparing medical paperwork, and making sure every step was covered. She shared only what was needed and kept the rest private, wanting to protect Richard from more stress. The doctor abroad continued guiding her through the process. Each step felt heavier than the last, but Amara didn't back down. She knew this wasn't just a medical procedure, it was her last act of love for a man who had treated her like a daughter. Richard eventually stopped trying to stop her. Instead, he promised to support her in any way he could. The mansion grew quieter as the day of the trip approached. No one else knew what was about to happen. Just a few people, one decision, and a chance that could either end in healing or in heartbreak. But Amara had made her choice, and she was ready. Richard had left the country for a short business trip. It was supposed to be only 4 days, a quick visit to close a deal in Germany. He almost didn't go, worried about leaving his father even for a few days. But Amara encouraged him, saying everything would be fine. Deep down, she knew this was her only chance. The moment his plane took off, she got to work. She contacted the doctor abroad to confirm their arrival. She collected the documents she had carefully prepared, some real, some forged, to help them travel without questions. Then she quietly packed a small bag for herself and another for Richard's father. It had clothes, medicine, medical records, and all the paperwork the foreign clinic had asked for. She arranged a private transport to take them directly to the airport. Richard's father didn't fully understand what was happening, but when Amara told him they were going somewhere to help him, he didn't argue. He trusted her completely and followed without resistance. They arrived at the international clinic late in the evening. The hospital staff was already waiting. Everything had been arranged for a discreet admission. The patient was quickly checked in and placed in a private room. Amara stayed by his side, answering medical questions and reviewing the final consent forms. The doctors reminded her of the risks again. She nodded. She had already made peace with her decision. That night she barely slept. She watched over him and made sure he was calm. At one point he looked at her and said softly, "You always take care of me." She smiled and held his hand. Before dawn, she sat at the small desk in the room and wrote a short letter. She folded it and left it on the nightstand beside his bed. It said only one thing: "If I don't wake up, know that your daughter said yes." She knew the morning would bring the most dangerous moment of her life, but she was ready. At sunrise, the doctors came in and began preparations for surgery. Amara kissed the old man on the forehead and whispered that everything would be all right. He didn't say much. He was drowsy from the medicine, but he squeezed her hand in response. They were taken to 2 different operating rooms, side by side. Amara was first. The surgeons began the delicate procedure to remove a section of her liver. It required careful monitoring and perfect precision. Once the removal was complete, another team carried it into the next room, where Richard's father was already prepared to receive the transplant. His body was fragile, and the surgery was high risk. The transplant team worked for hours, carefully connecting veins, arteries, and bile ducts. Both operations took nearly the entire day. Outside, the sun had set, and the sky was dark again. The hospital remained quiet, following the plan to keep everything confidential. No press, no calls, no distractions. Just 2 patients, side by side, fighting for their lives. Back in Germany, Richard had just finished a meeting when his phone rang. The number was foreign. Confused, he stepped out of the conference room and answered. A calm voice explained that Amara and his father were in a hospital in another country. The caller identified herself as a nurse and said both had just come out of surgery. Richard couldn't believe what he was hearing. What surgery? What hospital? The nurse told him that his father had received a liver transplant from a living donor, Amara. The news hit him like a punch. His body froze. His hands started shaking. He dropped his briefcase, grabbed his passport, and booked the next flight without even finishing the call. At the airport, he didn't care about lines or formalities. He was panicked and desperate, playing every possible scenario in his head. Were they okay? Were they in pain? Why hadn't anyone told him? As the plane took off, all he could do was sit there, helpless, hoping he wasn't too late. When Richard finally arrived at the clinic, it was early morning again. A nurse met him at the entrance and led him through quiet hallways until they reached the recovery wing. She opened the door slowly, and Richard stepped into the room. The sight froze him in place. His father lay in a hospital bed unconscious, tubes connected to machines that beeped steadily. Right beside him, in another bed, was Amara, pale, still, but breathing. The letter she had written was now folded on the table, next to his father's hand. Both of them were alive, but neither had woken up yet. Richard walked toward the bed, speechless. He didn't know whether to cry, scream, or kneel. Instead, he stood between the 2 people he loved most, his chest full of pain, gratitude, and guilt. He realized how far Amara had gone, how much she had risked. She had broken laws, kept secrets, and almost given her life, not because she had to, but because she chose to. He sat down in the chair between them, not knowing what to do. He held his father's hand with one and gently placed his other hand over Amara's. The machines continued to beep. Nurses came and went quietly, checking charts and monitoring their vitals. No one spoke much. Richard stayed there for hours, watching, waiting. At some point, a doctor came in and gave him the first update. The surgery had gone well. There were no signs of rejection so far. Both patients were stable, though weak. Recovery would take time. Richard nodded silently. He was still processing everything. The anger, the fear, and the shock had been replaced by something heavier: respect. He looked at Amara again and thought about everything she had done. This wasn't just loyalty. It was love. It was courage. And now they were tied together forever. Not by blood or contracts, but by choice. As the morning light came through the window, both still lay unconscious, side by side, but alive, connected, healed, and changed forever. Richard sat between the two hospital beds, still trying to process everything. His father was unconscious, but stable. Amara, in the next bed, remained under sedation, her body weak from the major surgery. Machines beeped steadily around them, showing that both were alive. But when Richard read the note Amara had left behind, "If I don't wake up, know that your daughter said yes," he broke down completely. He cried for a long time, unable to hold back. The weight of what she had done hit him fully. She had risked everything to save his father. She didn't tell him, didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for support. She just acted. Her decision came from love, not duty. Doctors passed by and nodded respectfully. Nurses checked vitals, but gave him space. The quiet moments between beeps and footsteps were filled with emotion. Richard stayed by their side, reading the same letter again and again, knowing that no words could ever thank her for what she had done. 2 days passed, and Richard barely left the room. He only stepped out when absolutely necessary. Nurses brought him food, but he barely ate. Then, on the 3rd day, something changed. His father began to stir. First, it was small movements, a hand twitch, a slight turn of the head. Then his eyes opened halfway. Richard stood up immediately, calling the nurse. Within minutes, the medical team entered and checked his father's condition. Slowly, the old man opened his eyes fully. He looked around, confused, but awake. His voice was weak and scratchy as he asked for water. Then he whispered something that made Richard smile through tears. "I want some toast." It was a simple request, but it meant everything. Richard sat beside him, told him where they were, and explained that the surgery was over. His father didn't ask about survival or statistics. He asked, "Where's Amara?" Richard looked toward the other bed. "She's resting," he said softly. "She's still fighting." The surgery had taken a toll on her, and the doctors didn't want to rush the process. Her liver would regenerate naturally, but it needed time, and so did the rest of her body. Richard visited her every hour. He held her hand, told her stories, and updated her even though she couldn't respond. Hospital staff started to speak about her. Nurses from other departments passed by to see the woman who had donated part of herself to save an elderly man. Some had tears in their eyes. Doctors spoke quietly in hallways, sharing the story with emotion. One nurse brought flowers and placed them by her bed. The respect for Amara grew every day. She was no longer just the maid. She was a hero in the eyes of everyone who heard the story. But even with the admiration, Richard stayed focused on one thing: seeing her wake up, hearing her voice again, making sure she came back. While Amara slept, Richard's father continued improving. Day by day, his strength returned. He ate small meals, sat up in bed, and even cracked small jokes with the nurses. But the biggest surprise came when the medical team reviewed his test results. Before the transplant, his cancer had been aggressive and nearly untreatable. The old liver had made it harder for medication to work. But now, with a healthy section of Amara's liver helping his system, the cancer started to respond. Medications that previously failed began to show results. The doctors were cautious but optimistic. They didn't call it a cure, but it was progress. A fight that seemed lost was now possible again. Richard shared the news with his father, who smiled weakly and said, "Then I still have some time left." But neither of them felt like celebrating without Amara awake. Her absence left a space in the room. Even though her name was on everyone's lips, her eyes remained closed. On the fifth day, just after lunch, a small miracle happened. Richard was sitting by her bed, reading quietly, when he felt her hand move. At first, he thought he imagined it. Then it moved again. He dropped the book, stood up, and called for the nurse. They entered quickly and began their checks. Slowly, Amara's eyelids moved. Her breathing changed slightly. She blinked, opened her eyes, and looked around, confused. Richard leaned in, smiling with relief. "You're back," he whispered. Then a voice came from the next bed, quiet but full of joy. "My daughter is awake." Amara turned her head and saw him. He was pale but smiling, alive and alert. Tears welled up in her eyes. She tried to speak but couldn't. She just nodded and smiled through the pain. The room filled with emotion. Doctors and nurses stood silently, letting the moment unfold. Richard stepped back, letting them see each other, knowing this was their moment. They had both come through the worst. As the days passed, recovery continued slowly but surely. Amara gained more strength with each passing hour. Her appetite returned, and so did her voice. The doctors were amazed at her determination. Richard stayed close, helping both of them whenever needed. He organized video calls so distant family members could speak with the old man. He answered questions from the medical team and made sure Amara had everything she needed. But the most important moments weren't the calls, the tests, or the reports. They were the quiet conversations between Amara and the man who now called her daughter without hesitation. Every time he looked at her, he smiled like someone who had been given a second life. And every time she looked at him, she saw not just a patient, but someone she had chosen to save, no matter the cost. The pain, the fear, and the risk had all led to this, a chance to live together. In that hospital room, their bond had become unbreakable. The sacrifice had been worth it. News of what had happened in the hospital didn't stay quiet for long. Within days, the story began to spread. At first, it was just a local article, a small piece in an online newspaper about a woman who had donated part of her liver to save an elderly man. But the headline caught attention. "Employee risks life to save employer's father." People started sharing the article on social media. More websites picked it up. Then larger news channels called the hospital asking for details. Soon, journalists from all over the country wanted interviews, photos, and statements. They described Amara as a hero, a symbol of kindness and sacrifice. Headlines used words like miracle, bravery, and unbelievable loyalty. Richard received dozens of emails from reporters asking to speak with her. Health organizations became interested too, not just in the story, but in what it represented. Could this act change the way the world thought about organ donation? Could love be reason enough to save a life? The attention only grew. National TV shows sent invitations. Health magazines offered to feature Amara on their covers. Talk shows called Richard's office asking for appearances. A few foundations offered awards. One organization even offered to pay for a full scholarship if she wanted to study nursing or medicine. But Amara refused them all. She didn't want cameras, lights, or microphones. She wasn't looking for a stage. For her, this hadn't been about recognition or praise. It had been a personal choice, born from love and a deep emotional connection. When Richard asked if she was sure, she said simply, "This story is not for sale." Her answer surprised everyone. In a world where people chased likes, followers, and applause, Amara only wanted peace and privacy. She asked Richard to protect her from the press, and he did. Anytime a reporter came close, he made it clear she would not speak. Her focus remained on recovery and on caring for the man she saw as a father. Back at the mansion, life slowly found a new rhythm. The old man, still recovering from the transplant, began to show more energy each day. He could now walk short distances without help. His appetite returned, and he spent more time outside, sitting in the garden or by the living room window. His voice grew stronger. He laughed more often. The doctors continued to monitor his condition, but the signs were positive. The liver transplant had given his body the support it needed, and the cancer, which once seemed unstoppable, was now shrinking. Medications were working as they should. Every small step forward was celebrated quietly between Amara, Richard, and his father. There were no big parties or public posts. Just meals shared at the table, soft conversations, and peaceful evenings. Amara stayed by the old man's side daily, checking his food, helping with exercises, and making sure he never felt alone. The world outside was watching, but inside the mansion, things were calm and simple. Richard, deeply changed by everything, saw the world with new eyes. Before the surgery, he had been consumed by work and business, always thinking of his next meeting, deal, or flight. Now, things were different. He spent more time at home, often sitting with his father, asking about his childhood, or just listening. He paid attention to things he had once ignored, like how his father took his coffee, or how Amara folded clothes with quiet care. The bond between them grew stronger. Richard felt regret for all the time he had wasted before, but he didn't dwell on guilt. Instead, he tried to make the most of every moment now. He also treated Amara differently, not with distance or formality, but with the respect and affection she had long earned. She wasn't just someone who worked for the family. She was part of it. Richard found comfort in her presence, often seeking her advice, or simply enjoying her company during quiet hours. The mansion itself began to change. What once felt like a cold, luxurious space now felt warm and alive. The living room, once silent and barely used, now echoed with conversations, laughter, and the sound of plates being set for dinner. The dining room, previously formal and stiff, became a place for relaxed meals and shared stories. Even the staff felt the difference. There was less tension, more smiles, and a sense that everyone was part of something bigger. Richard's father spent most mornings near the kitchen, where he could hear Amara moving around. He often called her just to talk or ask for tea, even if he didn't really need it. The house, once filled with silence and routine, had become a home again. Despite all the media attention outside, no one inside the house talked about fame. They talked about health, recovery, family, and gratitude. And the people who mattered were there, living each day fully and holding on to what was truly important. Still, the outside world kept trying to reach in. Journalists waited near the front gates. Messages continued arriving. Some people even sent gifts, letters, and thank you notes. But Amara remained exactly the same. She never changed her clothes for the cameras. She didn't wear makeup or rehearse statements. She avoided the news and didn't care what people were saying online. For her, the title she now carried in her heart was more than enough. Daughter by love. That was the only name that mattered. She had earned it through care, sacrifice, and presence. And that was where she wanted to stay, in the quiet role of someone who gave, who helped, who loved. She didn't need a spotlight. She only needed to see the old man getting stronger and smiling again. That was her reward. That was the proof it had all been worth it. In a world that wanted heroes, she simply wanted to live with peace in the place she now called home, as a daughter of the heart. 1 year had passed since the surgery. The mansion, once a place of silence and tension, now felt alive in every corner. It was the 79th birthday of Richard's father, and the house was full of people. Friends, neighbors, and family members arrived throughout the day, bringing gifts, food, and warm hugs. The main dining room had been decorated with care. Colorful tablecloths, balloons, candles, and photos from the past year lined the walls. In the center of it all was a large birthday cake, waiting for the moment the candles would be lit. Richard made sure everything was perfect, moving from room to room, welcoming guests and checking the music. Laughter echoed through the halls, conversations flowed naturally, and the once distant rooms now felt like part of a home. Richard's father sat at the head of the table, surrounded by people who cared about him. His eyes were full of life again. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. As the party went on, the atmosphere grew even warmer. The guests told stories from years ago, bringing up memories that made everyone smile. Some people hadn't seen Richard's father in years and were shocked at how well he looked. He walked slowly, yes, but he moved with confidence. He ate without help, cracked a few jokes, and seemed stronger than anyone had expected. The medical updates had been good for months, but seeing him like this in person made the progress real. People were surprised, even emotional, to see how far he had come. Richard couldn't stop filming. He took videos of guests laughing, the food being served, and his father enjoying the moment. He knew this was not just a birthday, it was proof of everything they had been through. Near the kitchen, Amara watched everything quietly. She wore a simple dress and a calm smile. She didn't like attention, but she was proud. This celebration wasn't only for the old man, it was for everything they had all survived together. Later in the evening, Richard asked for everyone's attention. He stood by the cake and spoke with honesty. "A year ago, we didn't think we would reach this day," he said, "but here we are, and it's because of courage, love, and sacrifice." He looked at Amara when he said that. Everyone turned to her, some applauding, others nodding in agreement. Amara lowered her head slightly, not wanting the focus, but her smile showed she appreciated the moment. Then came the big moment, lighting the candles. Richard's father sat up straight. He closed his eyes for a second, made a wish, and blew out all the candles at once. Everyone clapped. He laughed, louder than he had in a long time. Plates were passed around, drinks were poured, and people returned to their conversations. Amara stayed close to the old man, helping him slice his cake. He held her hand for a moment, not saying anything, just grateful. No words were needed. Everything was already understood between them. As the night continued, Richard's father moved to a quieter area of the house where fewer people were gathered. Amara helped him sit in a comfortable chair. They were joined by a few close friends who wanted to sit and chat. The old man looked relaxed. He drank tea, listened to others, and smiled often. Then, during a pause in the conversation, he turned to Amara. His voice was soft, but everyone heard him clearly. "Now, I'm really going to live, right, my daughter?" It wasn't a joke. It wasn't even a question for information. It was a question from the heart, one last confirmation that this second chance at life was real. The room went silent for a moment. Amara looked into his eyes. She didn't hesitate. She stepped closer, then gently got on one knee in front of him, holding his hands. "Yes," she said with certainty, "you're going to live." The moment touched everyone around. Some guests looked away to hide their tears. Richard watched the scene from across the room. He didn't interrupt. He just stood still, recording with his phone, but also with his heart. For him, everything that had happened over the past year came down to this moment. He remembered the hospital rooms, the surgeries, the fear, the waiting. He remembered Amara's silence, her strength, and the letter she left behind. He remembered how close they had come to losing everything, but they hadn't. They had made it through, all of them. And now, life was returning in small, simple ways. Shared meals, honest conversations, gentle smiles. Amara had never asked for anything in return. She just wanted the man she called father to live, and he did, better than anyone had expected. The house had changed. So had Richard. He no longer cared about business the way he once did. He cared about people, about presence. He felt connected, grounded, human, and more than anything, he was grateful for life, for love, and for second chances. As the night came to a close, most of the guests said their goodbyes. Some stayed behind to help clean up or share one last drink. The lights were dimmed and the music faded into a soft background hum. Richard's father stayed seated, still full of energy, still smiling. Amara stood beside him, not as a helper or an employee, but as part of the family. She didn't wear a title, but she had earned one that meant more than any official role. She was a daughter by heart, and no one questioned it. The old man reached for her hand again, squeezing it gently, and whispered, "Thank you." She nodded. That was enough. The story that had started with sickness and fear had turned into something full of life. There were no dramatic endings, no speeches, just quiet truth, quiet strength, and a promise that had been fulfilled. In that moment, everyone knew. Love, real love, had changed everything. Life had truly won over death. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.